In a new report from the Financial Times, private equity groups are allegedly loading companies that they own with fresh loans and then, this is great, using that cash to pay themselves big fat checks.
That's right. And 24% of money raised in the U.S. loan market so far this month has been used to fund monies to private equity owners. Editor-at-Large with Jacobin, David Sirota, he joins us more on how these groups are taking advantage of the demand for corporate debt and how they're basically profiting off of this crisis currently. Good to see you, David.
Good to see you.
David, just explain this, because I think it can be very complicated, to understand for a lot of people. But basically, 1/4 of money out there available to be loaned being taken by these companies who are then doing what with it? Explain it.
So basically, the companies, they float debt. They take a big loan. These are companies that are owned by private equity companies. So these are called portfolio companies. They will take a loan at a low interest rate, because there are low interest rate loans out there. That's what the Fed program has done. Those companies will take that loan and then use the money, the capital that they got from the loan, not necessarily to invest in the company or to, buy factory machinery or buy infrastructure for the company. The money, a certain percentage of that money, a lot of that money, then flows to the private equity manager, the owner of the company. So it's essentially taking a loan that could be used to invest in the company, invest in the business, but then the debt is simply used to enrich the private equity owner. And so obviously the public policy question is that really what the Fed policy should be doing, which is creating essentially more capital for the richest people in the country, billionaire owners, to simply use to enrich themselves? What good is that for the economy? I mean, I guess you could argue, if a private equity executive who's pulled off this kind of scheme is buying a new yacht or buying a new sports car, I guess you could argue that trickles down to the economy. But I think most people would say that that's not really the most efficient way or really the most moral way to try to boost an economy.
I mean, the most direct way of saying this is a direct, massive wealth transfer from the Fed to these already incredibly wealthy individuals. And one thing you pointed out, David, when we were, talking about doing this segment, is that private equity has done amazingly well in all sorts of ways, in part because of how they have so gamed and infiltrated the political system that they just get their way at every turn.
100%. I mean, we've seen a string of private equity victories under Donald Trump. You've seen the Labor Department has moved to allow private equity managers to get their hands on workers' 401k money. You've seen the so-called PPP funds, which were supposedly meant for small businesses. That money has flowed in a lot of ways to private equity firms that are owned by private equity, which again can trickle back up to the private equity managers. And it's not really a surprise that you've seen the biggest donor, one of the biggest donors to the Republican Party, is the CEO of the largest private equity firm in the country.
Right.
So there's a lot on the line for the private equity industry in this election. It's not to say that Joe Biden is going to, if he won, would get in there and completely crack down on the private equity industry. But Biden has put out a statement, for instance, on that retirement savings rule, saying that that's not acceptable. Biden, I think, would be a little less obedient when it comes to doing whatever the private equity industry wants. And let's remember one other thing. The private equity industry is notorious for downsizing, layoffs, for loading small businesses that they own up with debt in ways that aren't necessarily great for those companies. They're great potentially for the private equity managers. And private equity firms are known also for charging institutions like public pension funds huge fees and not delivering to actual investors the kind of returns that they promise they're going to return. So the point is that using more money, these loans, Fed policy, to further inflate the private equity industry, it really raises the question, what's the public policy imperative here?
Well, and one thing that really concerned me, David, I was reading a Wall Street Journal article this morning about how there are millions of homeowners who basically all their equity is tied up in homes and they have no cash. And that Wall Street and actually Blackstone Group, who you represented, JP Morgan, Koch Industries, and a few others are putting billions of dollars of cash pools and investments out there so that they can buy up your home and turn America into basically an eternal suburban rentier class. So basically, Wall Street will be your landlord, but for everybody. I mean, just imagine what control they'll have over American life if that's true.
And we saw that after the housing crisis, the original housing crisis back in the financial crisis, that you saw Blackstone at that point sweep in and buy up huge swaths of single-family homes that were previously homeowner owned, but then became rental properties. And there were all sorts of problems with maintenance. There was a huge Reuters investigation about people who were living in these homes being unhappy with basically having Wall Street as their landlord in terms of when you call the landlord, would you get the kind of response that you're supposed to get? So yeah, I mean, we're moving back to that kind of situation where Wall Street is your landlord. I mean, that's troubling. But we are in an economy where I would argue, especially when it comes to private equity, more and more of the economy is owned by private equity. More and more of the country, when you open the door behind a company that you're dealing with, there is a private equity owner there. And it's not good because private equity, I mean, there was a story about private equity in the healthcare industry, in the hospital industry,
right.
He's cutting costs and all that. And the point is that, there was an old model where there was businesses that were owned by owners in the community, and there was some kind of social bond there. Now you've got more and more of the economy owned by essentially Gordon Gekko on Wall Street, distant owners that are only about profits, maximizing profits, regardless of whether they strip these companies down to their bare bones and bankrupt them.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this too in the mobile home park buy-up too by private equity funds with absolutely disastrous and dehumanizing results. Great to have you as always, David.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Coming up, we're going to talk to North Carolina political reporter Andy Specht about how that battleground state is looking for Biden and Trump. They've already started voting there, actually. That When Rising continues.